Hey everybody, Rob Maurer here, and today we are talking about a new report on Tesla's expansion plans in China. We also have a scheduled date for Tesla's annual shareholder meeting, a couple of news items out of Europe, a report on Tesla's compensation, and a couple other items as well. A little bit quieter of a day in the stock market today. Feels kind of nice after last week. Tesla finishing up 0.7% to close at $909.25. The Nasdaq was up 0.2%, and relatively lower volume today. Tesla about 21 million shares traded. Of course, tomorrow there will be a little bit more excitement as the Fed will publish their statement from the May meeting 2 hours before market close. That'll be followed up with a press conference from Jerome Powell. So all eyes will be on that, and barring any other major news specific to Tesla, Tesla will probably just follow around the Nasdaq's reaction, whatever way that ends up being. And then while we're looking at the macro calendar, just quickly ahead to next week, the core CPI and PPI data will be released on Wednesday and Thursday respectively, Consumer Price Index and Producer Price Index. And those will be particularly interesting because we're starting to come up against the period last year where inflation really started to rise. So the numbers are starting to come up against higher benchmarks from last year. We'll get into Tesla specific news here in a second, but first just a quick update on Elon and the Twitter situation, which of course has been the predominant story over the last few days. Perhaps a little bit of a break on that today as Elon in the news for other reasons, and that was his appearance at the Met Gala, which thankfully we don't have to spend much time on, but did have to kind of chuckle at Elon taking the opportunity to pose in some humorous ways. Some of that caught on video circulating around Twitter, and Doge Designer on Twitter here with a comment that I think many listeners can probably relate to, saying, quote, "My entire net worth is in the hands of this man," end quote. Anyway, as far as news on the Twitter situation, not a whole lot today that would affect Tesla. For instance, we still don't have any updates or clarity on the collateral shares that Elon Musk is using right now that we had talked about yesterday. We'll continue to keep an eye out on that. Really, the only update today is a report from the Wall Street Journal, which is saying that Elon Musk has privately told potential investors that after taking Twitter private, he would eventually plan to re-IPO the company, and that could happen in as little as 3 years. That sort of communication should be very enticing to investors. I think a lot of people recognize that there is massive potential for Twitter from a business and evaluation perspective that just has not been able to be realized. And Elon's got a pretty good track record of unlocking those things, not to mention just the premium that Elon carries into evaluation himself. So knowing that Elon has plans for an eventual re-IPO shows that he will focus on the business model, will focus on creating value for shareholders with this, not just a pet project for free speech. Not to say that that's not an important element for Elon in this whole thing too, but I'm sure he feels he can do both. And ultimately, investors are going to be more focused on their potential return. So hearing things like this from Elon definitely makes it a much more enticing investment opportunity. And my suspicions that this was the eventual plan is part of the reason that I've felt pretty strongly that Elon's not going to have any trouble finding potential investors to fulfill whatever capital needs there are. So anyway, to tie that all back to Tesla, if Elon is successful in finding other potential investors, then obviously that reduces the financing pressure from Elon individually and therefore reduces the pressure on his Tesla stake. So from a Tesla perspective, probably good news. All right, getting into the Tesla specific news then. First, I just want to quickly talk about the annual shareholder meeting because Tesla has now set a date. They announced on Twitter late last night that the shareholder meeting will happen in Austin on Thursday, August 4th. Tesla also noted in an 8K filing about this announcement that the corresponding date of record for the shareholder meeting will be on June 6th. So the record date is basically used to determine share count for the proxy votes, as well as being the date for when ownership of a share is needed to be able to attend the annual meeting. Of course, with Tesla's fanfare as it is, they may have a little bit stricter of a requirement. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like. The last couple of years have been weird since Tesla got so popular as an investment. Both of those years have been affected by COVID, so we're just going to have to wait and see what Tesla does for attendance this time around. In 2020, the shareholder meeting was combined with Battery Day, and Tesla held a lottery for that event. And then last year, I can't remember exactly what they did, but it was the first one in Austin, so I think they may have just invited some local shareholders or something like that. But it was a pretty limited number. In any case, Tesla usually streams these events, and I wouldn't expect anything different this year. So we'll keep an eye out for how they're handling in-person stuff, but everyone should at least be able to see it live. As for the proxy statement or the items to be voted on at the shareholder meeting, people are going to be very curious about that this time around because that'll include information at least on what the maximum split ratio could be, as Tesla will ask shareholders to support expanding the issuable share count to facilitate a stock split. So as I said, the record date, June 6th. If we look back at last year, the record date had been August 9th. The proxy materials did come out on or about August 26th, Tesla said, but they did also file a preliminary proxy statement on August 13th. If a similar pattern holds this year, then we could see a preliminary proxy giving us a little bit more information on that split ratio a handful of days after June 6th. And then in terms of the actual split itself, that would need to follow the shareholder meeting when the issuable share count vote happens. So the earliest that would have to be after August 4th, though there would be no deadline on when it needs to happen by. And once a split is announced, it's usually going to be a few weeks before that actually takes place. So probably looking at the end of August at the earliest, that would probably be the best guess, but certainly could happen later, and Tesla might want to wait a little bit longer if the stock isn't at a great level at that point. All right, next up, we've got a report, kind of two reports here from Reuters within the same article on Tesla in China. Reuters is reporting on a letter allegedly from Tesla to Shanghai local government officials. For some reason, they've chosen to focus their headline on Shanghai authorities stepping up to help Tesla reopen their factory, which isn't really all that surprising. We know that Shanghai made this whitelist of companies that they were focusing on getting up and running. But Reuters notes that Shanghai authorities helped Tesla transport over 6,000 workers and carry out necessary disinfection work to reopen its factory last month. They say that the letter, dated May 1st, outlined the lengths to which the city went to help Tesla, indicating the US automaker's importance to Shanghai as the city tries to restart business while curbing the spread of COVID-19. So, okay, that's one part of it, but they seem to really bury the lead here because they continue on to note that, quote, the letter also outlined how Tesla planned to further expand its plant in Shanghai, confirming a Reuters report in February. The company will build a new plant on nearby land in the same area, which is poised to add an annual capacity of 450,000 cars, including Model 3s and Model Ys, becoming the, quote, world's largest vehicle export hub, the letter said, end quote. How that isn't more important than Shanghai helping Tesla reopen, I'm not really sure, but that seems like pretty major news, and this does match with rumors that I have heard. And I think a lot of people are going to conflate this with the rumored production expansion from May and July that we've talked about. That should bring production up to maybe 90,000 a month or something like that. Don't get confused on that. This is a separate thing. If the 450,000 annual capacity number is correct, and Tesla does indeed ramp up their current footprint up to about 90,000 vehicles per month, then you could be looking at a monthly production number of 130,000 vehicles or so. That would put Shanghai's annual capacity above 1.5 million. There are still people that think Tesla's only doing 500,000 out of Shanghai and that's about all it's ever going to be. And Tesla themselves have been a little bit coy on this, as in their earnings deck, they only list the installed capacity in Shanghai as greater than 450,000. My guess is that by sometime next year, it's going to be about triple that level. I don't think people really get that yet. And then of course you've got Berlin and Austin ramping up at the exact same time. So it is very exciting, and I think Shanghai is going to continue to move more aggressively than people expect. And I think a lot of that is being hidden right now just because of the shutdowns. But we have seen how quickly Tesla can bounce back from stuff like that, particularly in Shanghai, before. All right, while we are on the topic of China, just a quick follow-up on yesterday's story that we had talked about, some of the confusion around whether that 80% number meant that 80% of the whitelist companies had returned to work, or if of those companies, they were at least at 80% of their production capacity already. In the Tesla sphere, it was mostly reported as the latter. We got a couple of comments here from people with factories in Shanghai or that speak Chinese. The first couple of people here interpreted it as 80% of the workforce being allowed to return, which I think makes a lot more sense in terms of knowledge to have than saying that all these companies are at 80% of their production capacity at least, although presumably there'd be some correlation with those numbers. But then I did also hear from another native speaker that interpreted it as the resumption rate of those whitelisted companies exceeding 80%, which sounds a little bit more like 80% of those companies have restarted. So point being, I think it's either headcount or number of companies rather than total production capacity. And even from those that speak Chinese, the original report doesn't necessarily make that entirely clear. Certainly, we are not strangers to that happening in English as well, but just wanted to pass along that additional context, and thanks to those that did chime in to provide that. All right, next up, we've got a couple of updates in Europe. First, Tesla Audrey noticed that Tesla is hiring a new public policy and business development role for the European Union focused on vehicle automation. Kind of interesting to see Tesla be a little bit more active here. They say that this role will help define political strategy, participate and influence rulemaking and law drafting processes, and develop and maintain relationships with public, technical, and safety authorities, among other tasks. I think it's good that Tesla's being proactive on that, as they, in some cases in the EU, have already bumped up against some regulations limiting some features. The other update that we have is on Tesla opening up the Supercharger network to other non-Tesla vehicles. Of course, we know Tesla has been trialing this in Norway and has expanded that out to other countries as well. But we've got a report out of Norway that Tesla has now tripled the number of stations that they are allowing this third-party charging on. So apparently now in Norway, that is up from 16 to 58. And that also means that Tesla has the largest network of publicly available high-power chargers in the country. And that 58 stations, that is comprised of 812 individual supercharger connectors. That's about 2/3 of the roughly 1,200 connectors that Tesla has in the country. According to this article, the remaining 1/3 that can either be due to contract things that require Tesla to not be able to charge other vehicles, perhaps businesses that have other third-party charging, or another potential reason being high traffic superchargers that Tesla does not want to further congest by opening up to third parties. I think the latter one, that's probably the concern that most people would have with this strategy, so perhaps a little bit comforting that that does seem to be a factor that Tesla is considering, unsurprisingly, with this strategy. All right, next up, we've got a quick report on Tesla's compensation. So this was reported by Electrek today, got some attention. Electrek is saying that they have learned that Tesla, which used to offer bonuses to sales and delivery staff based on quarterly delivery quotas, both regional and store-based, Tesla has apparently eliminated those and instead has raised salaries for those employees to compensate for that change. So apparently those quotas could be up to 25%, and now base salaries have been raised by 12.5%. Which would obviously reduce the upside, but at the same time, reduce the downside for those employees. So just a different model, and because deliveries aren't necessarily fully in control of those individual employees, obviously a lot of that having to do with production and allocation and logistics, Tesla may have decided that that model didn't really make sense. But of course, Electrek assumes that that is a cost-saving move for some reason, and it's going to be a net compensation decrease. They say here, without really citing any sources, that the bonus model was quite successful for Tesla with delivery records for 7 quarters in a row. Historically, most Tesla employees have been getting their bonuses every quarter for the past 2 years, and therefore it will be a reduction in total compensation for them. Given that Electrek themselves point out that there were different quotas on a store level and a regional level, I'm not sure how they're figuring out that most employees were getting it. You'd either have to have a lot of information from a lot of employees over a long period of time, or leaked information from pretty high-level management to determine that. So certainly it is possible, but I think we would need a lot more information to determine that, and without Electrek sharing more about how they came to that conclusion, it does seem a little bit presumptuous. So just wanted to share my thoughts on that since it was somewhat heavily discussed today. All right, last couple of items here. First, we've got a little bit of coverage on Apple and a potential car project from them today. Bloomberg reporting that Apple has hired a 31-year veteran from Ford, specifically to be involved with the car project. Now, I think it's pretty easy to criticize hiring a veteran from Ford. I think that's a fair question around the hire, but it's probably a little bit harsh to judge an individual based on that. But anyway, just causing some more attention around the Apple car and any prospects there today. I think I've made my point of view on that pretty clear. I don't really expect anything from Apple on that, at least in terms of making their own vehicle within the next 5 years or whatever you want to call the foreseeable future. Last thing then, just a quick note that earnings reports continue to come in. One that may be notable was AMD. So they reported a pretty significant beat today and stock is up 7% after hours. Might be some good news for the tech market in general. That is where we'll leave it for today then. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you're subscribed and signed up for notifications. Also find me on Twitter at Tesla Podcast. And we'll see you tomorrow for the Wednesday, May 4th episode of Tesla Daily. Thank you.